This is Thomas Wayne Riley, and you have found yourself in the American Southwest. This is part 11 of my series over Billy the Kid and the Lincoln County War. On Saturday night, about 10 o'clock, Deputy U.S. Marshal Robert Olinger with Deputy Sheriff David Woods and a posse of 5 men, Tom Williams, Billy Matthews, John Kinney, D.M. Reed, and W.A. Lockhart, started for Lincoln with Henry Antrim, alias The Kid. The fact that they intended to leave at that time had been purposely concealed, and the report circulated that they would not leave before the middle of the week in order to avoid any possibility of trouble, it having been rumored that the Kid's band would attempt a rescue. They stopped in front of the semi-weekly office while we talked to them, and we handed the Kid an addressed envelope and some paper, and he said he would write us some things he wanted to make public. He appeared quite cheerful and remarked, no doubt in jest, that he wanted to stay with the boys, fellow prisoners in the La Mesilla jail, until their whiskey gave out anyway. Said he was sure his guard would not hurt him unless a rescue should be attempted, and he was certain that would not be done unless perhaps those fellows over at White Oaks come out to take me, meaning to kill him, to avenge the killing of White Oaks blacksmith James Carlisle. It was, Billy said, about a standoff whether he was hanged or killed in the wagon. Newman's Semi-Weekly, April 17th, 1881. In the last episode, Billy the Kid was taken from Stinking Springs to Las Vegas, and then from Las Vegas to Santa Fe before heading down to Mesilla, where he was convicted of the murder of the corrupt Sheriff Brady and sentenced to hang in Lincoln. As the opening quote emphasized, and as the previous lynch mobs highlight, getting to Lincoln could potentially be yet another adventure, a dangerous one. The semi-weekly newspaper of Newman hinted that they left secretly because the Kid's band may try to attempt a breakout. That was obviously impossible, as the Kid had no band, no more family, no more friends. They'd all been killed or run off. He was essentially on his own. But the law was taking no chances with Billy the Kid, and he was accompanied on his journey to Lincoln by a 7-man posse. And some of the men of this posse were the very men who have fought against him in the Lincoln County War. Some of these men had killed his friends. The posse included, as previously mentioned in the newspaper article, Deputy U.S. Marshal and Deputy Sheriff Bob Olinger. Olinger has been mentioned a few times, and he will be mentioned a lot in the beginning of this episode. He called himself Pecos Bob, and he was described at the time as being, quote, 200 pounds of bone and muscle, 6 feet tall, round as a huge tree trunk, with a regular gorilla-like chest that bulged out so far his chin seemed to be set back in his chest. He had a heavy bull neck, low-browed head topped with a shaggy hair, bushy eyebrows, and a hat-rack mustache. His arms were long and muscular, with fists like hams. End quote. Pleasant-sounding fellow, really. He had actively participated on the day of the big kill when McSween's home burned and he was murdered. At this point, he was seated across from Billy the Kid in the stagecoach. Billy Matthews, deputy to the dead Sheriff Brady, he sat in the stagecoach as well. He had personally sent the men to kill Tunstall. He had also been walking down the street when Sheriff Brady and Deputy Hindman had been killed. He had just testified against Billy the Kid. he was a House partisan and had celebrated and participated in the deaths of both Tunstall and McSween. And incredibly, and I could not believe it myself, the third man in the stagecoach and the man sitting beside the kid was none other than Boss Rustler Kinney. He had been deputized to bring the kid to Lincoln. This man had participated in the big kill. He'd sought out to kill the surviving man Salazar after the murders and the fire. He was one of the worst men in New Mexico and West Texas. He had killed soldiers and civilians and stolen countless cattle and horses and mules. He was a known friend and ally to Jesse Evans of the Boys. He was another House partisan. Yet here he was guarding the kid. 4 other armed men were on horseback as the stagecoach left Mesilla and headed for Fort Stanton. Once at the fort on April 21st, 1881, the kid was handed over to Sheriff Pat Garrett, who was now entrusted to keep the kid alive and imprisoned until he could personally hang the young outlaw. As if all of this wasn't incredibly surprising enough, with the men who were entrusted to guard Billy the Kid, once the kid arrived to Lincoln, he was not jailed in the little pit jail he once spent a brief stint in. Instead, in December of the previous year, 1880, the town had bought the house, as in the Dolan Murphy building, the actual house that the metaphysical house was named after, the house which had won the Lincoln County War. It was now the county courthouse. It's quite poetic, really. In that courthouse was the new jail. Billy the Kid was going to be jailed in the house's physical house as he awaits his hanging for fighting against the corrupt house. Yes, the house will always win. There was a jailhouse within the building on the 2nd floor, but Billy wasn't jailed there. He was put into a totally separate room in the northeast corner of the 2nd story of the once Dolan Murphy house. To get to his cell, one had to go into the building, up the stairs, through the hall, and then through Pat Garrett's sheriff's office before you reached the door to Billy's cell. They were not taking any chances. In June of 2025, I visited Lincoln, and of course I visited the Dolan Murphy store, turned courthouse, turned museum. I saw the cell and the office and the windows and the whole layout. I saw the bullet hole still entombed in the wall behind a protective glass at the bottom of the stairs. But I'm jumping ahead a bit here. To guard Billy the Kid, Pat Garrett assigned Deputy James W. Bell and the giant bully of a man, Deputy U.S. Marshal Bob Olinger. James Bell was a resident of that boom town known as White Oaks, and he had actually been in the posse that had attempted to track down the kid. He had been with the men who surrounded the Great House Ranch before the 2 Billies and Rudabog had killed the White Oaks blacksmith, that man being James Carlisle. And Carlisle had been a neighbor and friend to James Bell. So Bell had no love for Billy the Kid. But he didn't hate him like Olinger did. Speaking of Bob Olinger, he was a brute. Olinger, with his big old shotgun, had taunted and tormented Billy the Kid on the 5-day journey from Mesilla to Fort Stanton. Olinger apparently told the kid to go on, try to escape, and then he would poke the kid with his shotgun. Pat Garrett would later say of their relationship, quote, "There existed a reciprocal hatred between these two, and neither attempted to disguise or conceal his antipathy for the other." End quote. Bob Olinger, also nicknamed the Tall Sycamore of 7 Rivers, was a known chaser of cattle rustlers, thieves, and the regulators. He was also known as the meanest man in New Mexico. Pat Garrett himself said of Olinger that he was, quote, "born a murderer at heart. I never slept out with him that I did not watch him." End quote. In 1879, Olinger had actually murdered a man named John Jones, who Billy the Kid knew. John Jones is the man who probably killed Beckwith on accident or purposefully, and that was moments before McSween himself was killed. Olinger no doubt killed Jones for this murder. Billy the Kid and the Jones were on opposite sides of the war, but Billy the Kid had known the Jones family before he joined Tunstall and the Regulators. It was said that Billy the Kid told Ma'am Jones that he would one day avenge the murder of her son, a murder which happened right in front of his wife and child, Jones's wife and child. Well, Billy allegedly said he would avenge the murder. This promise was probably added much later to make the story more palatable. I'm not sure he saw Ma'am Jones to even say that to her, but it could be legend. It probably is. Olinger's shotgun that he used to taunt the kid with was a rather curious weapon. It was a Whitney double-barrel 10-gauge with 2 trigger guards and 3 triggers. The forward trigger released the breech loader, which allowed the user to load the gun's 2 chambers, which were filled with 18 buckshot. Olinger once told the kid, after he loaded it in view of the prisoner, quote, "The man that gets one of these loads will feel it," end quote. To which the kid replied, quote, "I expect he will, but be careful, Bob, or you might shoot yourself accidentally," end quote. On April 27th, Sheriff Pat Garrett left Lincoln for some business throughout his county. He was going to collect some taxes from the various towns, including White Oaks. Also on that day, Governor Wallace sat down for an interview with the Las Vegas Morning Gazette. During the interview, the reporter eventually asked about Billy the Kid. The conversation went like this, quote, "It looks as though he would hang, Governor." "Yes, the chances seem good that the 13th of May would finish him." "He appears to look to you to save his neck." "Yes," said Governor Wallace, smiling, "but I can't see how a fellow like him should expect any clemency from me." Although not committing himself, the general tenor of the governor's remarks indicated that he would resolutely refuse to grant the kid a pardon. It would seem as though the kid had undertaken to bulldoze the governor, which has not helped his chances in the slightest. End all quotes. And this bulldozing the journalist referenced is about Billy the Kid trying to blackmail the governor into issuing that pardon. The whole territory knew the governor had that pardon, but the territory had turned on Billy the Kid, and so had the governor. Long ago, really. While Billy was waiting for the news, Pat Garrett would allow McSween partisan and Tunstall store clerk Sam Corbett to visit Billy every day. The man was a friend of the kid and the Regulators, one of the kid's only friends left, although Sam Corbett himself never took part in any action. That was about to change, actually. The day after Pat Garrett left for tax collecting, Sam Corbett, as he always did, visited the kid's cell. The two talked, who knows what about, but during the conversation, Corbett slipped Billy a note. The note had one word written on it: privy. Unbeknownst to the jailers, Sam Corbett had hired a young man named Jose Aguayo to head to this section of the town's outhouse. This outhouse was shared by the prisoners, their guards, and anyone nearby who needed to use the John. Aguayo had ambled into the outhouse with a newspaper, and in the newspaper was a pistol. And this pistol was hidden in the outhouse. The kid was going to attempt an escape. Around noon on the 28th of April, 1881, Bob Olinger took 5 of the prisoners across the street to Wortley's Hotel for their lunch. He did this every day. The kid, though, was not allowed to leave, so his lunch was brought to him. So at noon, Olinger and 5 prisoners left the house. Only Bell, who got along fine with the kid by all accounts, despite the kid having killed Carlisle. Well, only Bell was there to guard the prisoner. As soon as big old Bob was gone, though, the kid conveniently needed to use the restroom, the privy. Bell led the shackled man to the outhouse outside and then waited around. Inside the privy, Billy the Kid found the pistol and tucked it into his pants. With his business complete, Billy exited the outhouse and was being led back inside the house, followed closely by Bell. They entered the building and began ascending the stairs when Billy yanked the gun from his pants, turned, and aimed the pistol in the direction of Bell. Bell, surprised, reached for the armed Billy the Kid, and in the scuffle, the pistol went off. The bullet whizzed around the space between them harmlessly. Bell and the kid then wrestled for a moment, but Bell could not get the pistol out of the shackled Billy's hands. Bell, realizing the danger, gave up the scuffle, turned, and ran down the stairs to escape and get back up. At the base of the stairs, though, Billy fired the pistol to prevent Bell's escape. The bullet ricocheted off the wall, passed completely through Bell's body, and slammed into the wall at the base of the stairs. Bell, despite his wound, ran out of the back of the courthouse and directly into the arms of the cook, Godfrey Goss, where he died. Goss had been the cook for Tunstall and the Cowboys at the cow camp, but he was now living in Lincoln, in a house directly behind the courthouse and jail. He would later tell a reporter of that moment, quote, "I came out of my room, whence I had gone to light my pipe, and was crossing the yard behind the courthouse, when I heard a shot fired, then a tussle upstairs in the courthouse, somebody hurrying downstairs, and Deputy Sheriff Bell emerging from the door, running toward me. He ran right into my arms, expired the same moment, and I laid him down dead." End quote. After killing Bell, Billy hobbled with his shackles back to his room past the sheriff's office, but not before grabbing Ollinger's big old shotgun. He then ran to the window that faced east towards Wortley's hotel and waited for Bob Ollinger to return. Ollinger, meanwhile, at the hotel, stood up quickly after the shots and said to the room, quote, "They are having a fight over there." End quote. He then left the prisoners at the table and ran across the street. As Ollinger approached the courthouse, Goss yelled, "Bob, the kid has killed Bell." The two men came together as they approached the gate that would lead them towards the backyard. But as they walked, Billy allegedly shouted, "Hello, old boy." Or he said, "Hello, Bob." He probably said neither, honestly. But when Bob Ollinger appeared, Billy the Kid pulled both triggers of Bob's big shotgun. And according to Goss, Ollinger was, quote, "struck by a well-directed shot fired from a window above and fell dead." End quote. The man had just taken 36 pieces of lead from the same weapon he'd been taunting the kid with. Indeed, the man that gets one of these loads will feel it. Goss, despite having been close to the kid at one time, now felt like his life was in danger. But Billy assuaged those fears when he yelled down, "Don't run, I wouldn't hurt you." He then asked Goss if he could throw the kid something so that he could break loose of his shackles. Goss found a prospecting pick and tossed it up to the kid. Incredibly, the kid worked for a whole hour at getting his shackles off. A whole hour. And during that hour, Sam Wortley came up into the courthouse and, quote, "made himself generally useful," end quote. In that hour, the two men only got one of Billy's legs free from his shackles. At that point, he took the leg bracelet and attached it to his belt, grabbed 2 pistols and a Winchester rifle from the sheriff's armory, and exited the courthouse from the back. According to Goss, as Billy passed James Bell's dead body, he said, quote, "I'm sorry I had to kill you, but couldn't help it." End quote. I assume it's because he would have ran and gotten back up. At Ollinger's body, though, Billy nudged him with his boot and said, quote, "You are not going to round me up again," end quote. While Billy had been getting off his shackle with Wortley, Goss had saddled a horse that belonged to a man named Billy Burt. Before he mounted the horse, though, Billy the Kid went around and shook everyone who had gathered around the courthouse's hand. He had some difficulty getting on the horse, but once he did, he told Burt not to worry. He would return the horse the following day, which he did. The horse came trotting back into town the very next morning. During this whole 1-hour violent scene, only 2 men in Lincoln gathered up the courage to stop the Kid's escape. One man, John Lilly, the man who ran the restaurant at the Wortley Hotel, he apparently picked up his gun and was about to start across the street when his friends stopped him. What if John Lilly missed? What if the townsfolk turn on you? That's what they probably said. So Lilly put down his pistol. Another man, LaRue, he took his rifle from off the mantel and was about to step outside when his wife, rather smartly, discouraged him from stopping the outlaw. Now, contrary to Mark Lee Gardner's retelling into Hell on a Fast Horse, which he took from Pat Garrett's book, the Kid did not snap the shotgun in half and throw it at Olinger's body while cursing at him. Neither did he slip off his wrist cuffs after working on them for an hour and throw them at Bell's body before also cursing him. That was Upson and Garrett's own personal embellishment to the story which Gardner took as gospel. From Lincoln, Billy rode west and into the Capitan Mountains. He'd stay the night at a goat herder friend's ranch named Jose Cordova. Cordova would also get him out of his irons, give him another horse, and he probably took Bert's horse back to Lincoln for the Kid. From Cordova's, Billy rode to the ranch of fellow Lincoln County warfighter Salazar, the man who had taken the bullet, dragged himself to his sister-in-law's, been threatened by Kinney, and then recovered. He now owned a ranch near Las Tablas, the same place that Billy once wanted to start a ranch, actually. Salazar would house and feed the Kid before telling him, smartly, to leave for old Mexico and never come back. Mark Lee Gardner tells the story of Billy next visiting some friends named John Meadows and Tom Norris, but I do not know where he got that story. In the telling, though, Billy eats with the 2 men before telling them of his escape. Billy then is supposed to have said about the killings, quote, "It was a case of have to, not of wanting to," end quote. Meadows and Norris also told Billy, apparently, to flee as quickly as he could for old Mexico. Billy instead would head to Fort Sumner. By May 1st, news was spreading of his escape. From the Las Vegas Morning Gazette. News by telegraph. Billy the Kid escapes from the Lincoln County Jail and kills Bob Olinger and J.W. Bell. On May the 3rd, the Santa Fe Daily New Mexican prints the governor's new reward. Billy the Kid, $500 reward. I will pay $500 reward to any person or persons who will capture William Bonney alias the Kid and deliver him to any sheriff in New Mexico. Satisfactory proofs of identity will be required. Lew Wallace, Governor of New Mexico. For the next few weeks, newspapers all over the nation would print the most outrageous stories of the Kid, almost all of them untrue and ridiculously salacious. Author George R. Matthews calls one newspaper's lies venomous rhetorical flourishes. Newspapers as far away as Dublin in Ireland and London in England printed invented stories of his escape and life. The always colorful Illustrated Police News would call Billy the Kid my favorite nickname given to him so far, the boss desperado and man-killer of the Southwest. They'd also make up incredible and incredibly fake stories, but they weren't the only ones. The governor turned novelist, would even be interviewed, and he'd make up quite a colorful past for Billy the Kid. Almost completely inaccurate, but colorful nonetheless. Pat Garrett himself, in his own book he wrote with Ash Upson, would add to the lies an incorrect truth. But the way it all went down is the way I told it, via George R. Matthews. As a matter of fact, I can confidently say this whole series I have presented thus far is as accurate as can be with regards to Billy the Kid and the Lincoln County War. And that is thanks to George R. Matthews and Maurice G. Fulton. The newspapers after the escape were filled with rumors and stories guessing Billy's whereabouts and his next moves. They guessed who he was going to kill next and what score he was going to settle. But in reality, Billy was just at Fort Sumner, hiding from the law and laying very low. Eventually, by late May, the newspapers would also be hip to this truth. And a few were asking why he was being able to live so comfortably, or remain alive at all. Pat Garrett, sheriff, probably knew that Billy the Kid was living in Fort Sumner as June rolled around. But Fort Sumner wasn't in Lincoln County. He wasn't sheriff of them parts. Plus, in the meantime, he had bought Wortley's Hotel. And on top of that, his wife had had their first child, a daughter they called Ada. There was also the fact that Fort Sumner residents were not only harboring and helping Billy the Kid, but they were protecting him as well. As Pat Garrett would later say, Billy, quote, had many friends who were true to him, harbored him, kept him well supplied with territorial newspapers, and with valuable information concerning his safety, end quote. Still, the kid had escaped under his, Pat Garrett's, watch, and had, during the process, killed 2 of his deputies. Sheriff Pat Garrett couldn't sit on his hands forever. He would eventually have to make a move on the world-famous outlaw, and now escape artist. Finally, in July of 1881, the time came for Pat Garrett to saddle his horse, strap on his guns, and hunt down Billy the Kid. The world would be watching. It's anyone's guess why on earth Billy the Kid did not flee to old Mexico or California or Texas or heck anywhere. He told Meadows and Norris, if that story's true, that he couldn't run because he had no money. But my assumption is Billy needed people around him he loved and who loved him back. He was 21 years old, so not a kid any longer. But the man had not had a stable family since his mother died. But I would argue long before that. When he had people around him who cared about him, he wanted to stick with them. He wanted to stick around. Whether they were his regulator brothers, or Mexicans, or even if they were outlaws, he did not care. If he fled to Mexico, he'd have to start all over yet again. I don't think he had it in him. He'd already watched too many of his friends and family die or run off. Billy had people in Fort Sumner. He felt safe. He probably thought the world would eventually move on from him and he'd finally be able to settle down. Again, I have no idea if any of this is true. Maybe he knew none of it would last and he was just waiting to take his medicine. Regardless of the reason or reasons why Billy the Kid stayed in Fort Sumner, it would prove to be his final mistake. In early July, Pat Garrett would contact Brazil, who had helped capture Billy the first time, and Garrett asked him if he wanted to help capture Billy a second time. Brazil responded with yes. So Garrett told Brazil to meet him at the mouth of the Taiban Arroyo an hour after dark on the night of July the 13th. The meeting spot is 5 miles south of Fort Sumner. At that allotted time, Brazil never showed up. So eventually, Sheriff Pat Garrett and two of his deputies, John Poe and Thomas McKinney, decided to bed down and wait for sunrise. John Poe had recently replaced Frank Stewart as head detective of the Panhandle Cattlemen's Association, and he was in the area to round up stolen cattle. He was happy to tag along and become deputized. John McKinney was a Roswell resident and friend of Pat Garrett, who was also in the area and also agreed to help capture or kill Billy the Kid. So on the morning of July the 14th, the three men rode to the hills south of Fort Sumner and spied through some field glasses or binoculars. They spied down onto the town to see if they could spot the outlaw. After some time, Garrett asked Poe to head into town. No one would know him. So he told him to go into town and gather some info. He then told him to leave the town after the reconnoiter and head north and interview a ranch owner up that way that Garrett knew. He then told Poe to meet them a few miles north of Fort Sumner at sundown at a place known as La Punta de la Glorieta. At 10 a.m., Poe rode into Fort Sumner and began his intel mission. It would be an utter failure. For 3 hours, he tried to get anyone, to talk, but not a single resident of Fort Sumner would say a word about Billy to this suspicious man. So he rode up to talk to the rancher as instructed, but he too refused to say a word about Billy or his whereabouts. So Poe rode to the meeting point where he informed Garrett and McKinney that his mission was a complete letdown. Not a scrap of info was gathered or collected. With few options left, Garrett decided he himself would just wander into town and talk with Pete Maxwell, Paulita Maxwell's brother and the man who had inherited Fort Sumner from his father, Lucien Bonaparte Maxwell. As they were approaching the town from the north, though, the three lawmen ran into a Texan named Jacobs, and Jacobs knew John Poe, the cattleman detective. After visiting with the man and having some coffee, the three lawmen decided to head into town and have this chat with Pete Maxwell. They entered the town, as I mentioned, on the north end. On the north end, there also happened to be a long orchard that ran east to west. As they passed through the orchard silently, they saw a man to the east of them. According to Garrett, the man was getting up from the ground, quote, in full view, but too far away to recognize. He wore a broad-brimmed hat, a dark vest and pants, and was in his shirt sleeves. End quote. This man that had just gotten up then said a few things to someone on the ground who had been next to him or possibly underneath him. The man then went over to the fence, jumped it before crossing the road and walking into the old fort's parade ground. George R. Matthews writes of this scene and says, quote, Garrett later claimed that he learned the man standing up, apparently after having sex with a girlfriend in the orchard, was Billy Bonney. End quote. The three men did not yet know it was Billy, so they continued their entrance into town. They came around to the west side and approached Pete Maxwell's home. Garrett, remember, had lived at Fort Sumner for 2 years. He knew Pete Maxwell's bedroom was in the old officers' quarters on the southeastern corner of the large building. His bedroom door was on a porch. Garrett would later write that, quote, when we reached the porch in front of the building on the south side, I left Poe and McKinney at the east end of the porch, about 20 feet from the door of Pete's room, and went in. End quote. He continues. It was near midnight, and Pete was in bed. It was July, and in the summers of New Mexico, if you don't have air conditioning, which no one did at this time, nor do I now. In the summer, you open all the windows in the house at night, and he closed them all in the morning. I'm up at almost 7,000 feet, and the night's air keeps the house cool until late afternoon, unless a monsoon comes and graciously clouds out the sun. The open windows and door allowed Pat Garrett to hear what was going on inside. Once inside, because he walked through the door, Garrett went over to Pete Maxwell's bed, sat beside him, and he asked the man where the heck Billy the Kid was. A no doubt startled Maxwell gathered his wits and told Garrett that Billy, quote, had certainly been about, but he did not know whether he had left or not, end quote. So, I will now quote Matthews at length, who himself quotes Pat Garrett's own retelling of the killing of Billy Bonney the Kid. But before I do, Matthews mentions who Billy the Kid is staying with. Well, that woman, Celsa Gutierrez, is Pat Garrett's sister-in-law. Here's Matthews. Quote, apparently, Billy was boarding with friends upon his return to Fort Sumner after his escape from Lincoln. On the night of July 14th, Billy was staying with Sabal Gutierrez, a 31-year-old sheep herder, his wife Celsa, age 25, and their 4-year-old daughter, Maricia. The Gutierrez family lived in 2 rooms of the former quartermaster building on the south side of the old parade ground. Upon entering the Gutierrez home, Billy had removed his hat and boots. Being near midnight, Sabal, Celsa, and their daughter were likely asleep. Feeling hungry, Billy grabbed a butcher knife from the kitchen and started out the front door to go over to Pete's and get some beef. Outside, hatless, in his stocking feet, and carrying a butcher knife, Billy turned left and walked the short distance to the street corner. Here, he crossed the street diagonally in front of the dance hall where he had been photographed a year and a half before. Within a step of the Maxwell porch, Billy saw 2 crouched figures on his right. He sprang onto the porch and called out, "Q&S, who is it?" several times as he backed away toward the open door to Pete Maxwell's bedroom, 20 feet away, on the south side of the house. Poe and McKinney did not answer. Billy backed into the doorway, calling out to Maxwell, "Pedro, ¿quiénes son estos hombres afuera?" "Pete, who are those men outside?" Maxwell didn't answer. Billy turned and stepped across the dark room toward Maxwell's bed. Garrett whispered to Maxwell, "Who is it, Pete?" In a hushed tone, Maxwell replied, "That's him." Billy quickly stepped backwards across the room, asking, "Q&S, Q&S." Sitting on the edge of the bed, Garrett drew his revolver and fired, and diving to the floor, fired again. Maxwell, wanting to get out of the way, leapt up, plunged over the foot of the bed, dragging the bedclothes with him, and ran out the door. Garrett scrambled to his feet and ran out just behind him. "What the hell happened in there?" Poe asked Garrett. "That was the kid, and I think I got him." "Pat, the kid would not have come here," said Poe. "You've shot the wrong man." "I'm sure it was him. I know his voice too well to be mistaken," replied Garrett. But no one would go inside. Maxwell hurried down the porch into another room and returned with a lighted candle. Pete took a candle and held it around in the open window, Delavina Maxwell later said, and Pete stood back in the dark where he could see into the room. When they saw that he was dead, they both went in. Garrett's first shot had struck Billy in the left breast, near the heart, killing him almost instantly. His second shot had missed. An angry crowd had gathered by the time Garrett and Pete Maxwell reemerged from Maxwell's bedroom. Delavina Maxwell pummeled Garrett's chest. "You pisspot!" she screamed. "You son of a bitch!" Other women who admired Billy, Celsa Gutierrez, Nazario Yerby, Abrana Garcia, and Paulina Maxwell, must have been equally devastated. Many of the young men, friends of Billy, shouted threats and insults at Garrett and his two deputies. The situation was becoming dangerous. "We spent the remainder of the night on the Maxwell premises," said Poe, "keeping constantly on our guard as we were expecting to be attacked by the friends of the dead man." End all quotes. And with that, the saga of the outlaw, cattle thief, former regulator, the boss desperado and man-killer of the Southwest, Billy the Kid, came to an end. No more violence would occur that night after Pat's shot in the dark. The room would soon become well lit as nearly everyone in town came with a candle to say prayers or mourn over the kid. Delavina, the Maxwell servant and ex-Navajo slave, she apparently loved Billy the Kid like he was her own son. She had made him blankets. It was said that Billy the Kid was Delavina's idol. When she saw that the kid had gone the way of all the earth, she cried out towards Pat, "My little boy is dead." Paulita Maxwell, who also knew the kid very well, may have even been in the peach orchard with him, although it's unknown who he was rolling around in the hay with before he was killed. Paulita, though, she entered the room and had a long look over Billy the Kid, her Billito, as she called him. He had indeed gone on to the next great adventure. As a matter of fact, everyone that came to pay their respects that evening knew that Billy the Kid was lying there with a single bullet hole in his chest. A bullet hole that curiously did not start bleeding until 2 hours after he was shot. But everyone saw the kid's corpse, and they recognized it as their friend. And this is important because of the whole Brushy Bill Roberts saga, which I will not be getting into. Mainly because I don't believe a word of it. If you are interested in that imposter, you can look him up yourself. But no, Billy the Kid was dead, shot by Pat Garrett in the dark of Pete Maxwell's bedroom in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. The following morning, Justice of the Peace, Alejandro Seguro, he convened a coroner's jury. Rudolph, who had been sent by Pat Garrett to spy on Billy the Kid the previous day, he was the president of the jury. 5 other local jurors were present. Billy the Kid was still in Pete's room when the men gathered around the dead outlaw and concluded unanimously, quote, "We, the jury named, find unanimously that William Bonney has been killed by a bullet in the left breast in the region of the heart, fired from a pistol in the hand of Pat F. Garrett." End quote. They then said, quote, "The act of Garrett was justifiable homicide, and we are unanimously of the opinion that the gratitude of all the community is due to said Garrett for his deed, and that it is worthy of being compensated." End quote. Again, Brushy Bill Roberts was an imposter and a liar. Billy's body was then taken to the carpenter shop where he was washed and fitted for a coffin that the previously mentioned Paco Anaya will purchase. Henry McCarty, a.k.a. Henry Antrim, William H. Bonney, Billy the Kid, was then buried in the old Fort Cemetery on July the 15th, 1881. Nearly the entire town of Fort Sumner was in attendance. Gardner claims that the scripture read was Job chapter 14. "Man that is born of a woman is of few days and full of trouble. He cometh forth like a flower, and is cut down. He fleeth also as a shadow, and continueth not." His grave marker read only, Billy the Kid. In the summer of 2025, I visited the town of Fort Sumner with some friends. It may sound a little silly, but these friends and I call ourselves regulators. I am the president of the New Mexico chapter of an American fraternity called the Old Glory Club, and I named our chapter Regulators of the Rio Grande. My friends and I visited the town, went to the fun but hokey Billy the Kid Museum, before heading to the old fort. Located at what remains of the fort is a graveyard. You can see the Maxwell's graves, other townsfolk's resting places, and the triple grave of Tom Folliard, Charlie Beaudry, and William H. Bonney. Atop the large stone simply reads, Pals. After his death, Billy the Kid became a demon in the press, quite literally. One newspaper called him a vampire, not to be confused with the 1966 Billy the Kid vs. Dracula film. Other papers at the time began to, yet again, write incredibly false and ridiculous stories about him, which grew his legend to an outrageous proportion. Most of the papers got his name wrong, or his age wrong, or both. None of them knew where he was from. A lot of them said New York. Most of them claimed he'd killed a man for every year of his life, which would equal 21 men. Some claimed he was a contract killer. All these stories were full, as George R. Matthews puts it, of poppycock. Actually, there was one Indiana newspaper that got nearly everything right, from his birthplace to his name and age, but that paper was the exception. Part of the problem, it did stem from Pat Garrett himself. He could never get the story straight. He, at one point, claimed Billy had a pistol in his hand, and then another time he had a butcher knife and a pistol. And the pistol and a butcher knife story is what Mark Lee Gardner ran with, but Billy had no pistol. No pistol was recovered from the scene of Billy's death. He was indeed only holding a butcher knife. But that wasn't to harm any man. It was to take a slice of meat from Pete's stores. Later in life, Pat Garrett said, quote, I sometimes wish that I had missed fire and that the kid had got his work in on me. End quote. Pat Garrett's life, despite being the heroic killer of the infamous murdering outlaw, was not an easy or a happy life. It had its moments, but immediately after the killing, Pat Garrett became a sensation. Newspapers wrote about him, job offers came through. Things should have been smooth sailing for the lawman, but the trouble started almost immediately. First of all, it took months for Garrett to receive the first $500 check for capturing Billy, and for this second time, it was even longer. Governor Wallace was no longer governor, and the new governor did not want to fulfill the reward on a technicality. He said, well, it appears that the offer was a personal one from the previous governor, and I, as acting governor, never made this offer, nor did the new governor. So Wallace was out, and the new governor, Sheldon, he was over in D.C. to see his friend, which was the President of the United States, who had just been shot. This acting governor, William Rich, was being quite the miser. Not even Catrone, the leader of the Santa Fe ring, could convince the acting governor to hand over the reward to Pat. But it really didn't matter, because in Santa Fe, Jimmy Dolan, the leader of the Lincoln County House, he collected over $1,000 for the sheriff, and 1,000 more would soon flow in. You'd think that would be an incredibly comfortable cushion for the married father of one in humble Lincoln County. But the man was not the best businessman, nor was he great with money. And then, slowly, the public, or some of the American reader public, they began to turn on Pat Garrett. They called him a coward for shooting in the dark. They called him a coward for shooting an unarmed Billy. And a lot more false stories were published about Pat Garrett. So to answer this, Garrett teamed up with the aforementioned Ash Upson, who at one point lived with Billy the Kid. Pat Garrett and Ash Upson, they teamed up and wrote Garrett's side of the story. Unfortunately, it was full of half-truths and lies as well. The first half especially was almost no different than the dime novels being published at that time about the kid. The title of his book, though, is impressive. It is called The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid, the noted desperado of the Southwest, whose deeds of daring and blood made his name a terror in New Mexico, Arizona, and northern Mexico. I mean, that is truly impressive. Northern Mexico, though? Unfortunately for Pat Garrett, the book was not a bestseller, and it only had one printing at that time. And then, a year after Billy the Kid's death, in 1882, Garrett was in Albuquerque when he was approached by Joseph McCarty, Billy's half-brother. The two talked, and apparently, Joseph came away saying that Garrett had done the right thing. In February of 1882, Garrett would finally get the $500 reward from New Mexico. He was also given quite a few mementos and awards. At the end of his term as sheriff, Garrett, surprisingly, would not seek re-election. Instead, in November, he would run in the territorial council, but he would not win his seat. After the loss, he would become a rancher, and his herd was rather large by 1883. And then in 1884, after 200 cowboys went on strike in the Texas Panhandle, every one of them were fired. So now, essentially, Texas had 200 ex-cowboys turned rustlers. Well, Pat Garrett, the man finder, he was hired and paid $5,000 to lead a group of lawmen to put a stop to the rustling. One of his deputies was Barney Mason. He only did this a year, though, but he was incredibly successful at catching them thieves. Also in 1884, Juan Patron, he would be assassinated in a saloon in Las Vegas. His assassin either killed him over something from the Lincoln County War or over some gambling debts. Also, unfortunately, in that year, John Chisholm would die of cancer in Arkansas. In 1885, Garrett moved his family to Las Vegas, New Mexico, because he was now chief of the Southwest Livestock Detective Agency. Also in that year, he would help some Scottish man spend some $300,000 in the purchase of various ranches around New Mexico. He would become the man's ranch manager at the Double V Ranch. But that job would only last a year. He then headed back to Roswell to try his hand at farming. And by 1889, this venture was proving rather lucrative. He and his business partners had 40,000 acres of irrigated land. They eventually created a new town that they called Eddy, but what is modern-day Carlsbad. Pat Garrett was making a lot of money, but he was also spending a ton of money. He was investing in every business idea everyone approached him with, and eventually his spending forced him out of his business venture. In 1890, Garrett ran for sheriff of the new county of Chavez, and Chavez was split off of Lincoln County. The problem was, despite his credentials and popularity, Garrett had had a falling out with his friend Poe, the man who helped him hunt Billy the second time. The falling out was because Garrett owed him money, but by now Garrett had no money, which was a constant and continuing problem. Because of this, Poe would back Garrett's contender, and his contender won. By now, Garrett had 4 children with Polinaria, and in 1891, he moved the whole family to Uvalde, Texas. One of his daughters, Elizabeth Garrett, would actually end up writing the New Mexico state song, which is titled "Oh Fair New Mexico." By the end of his life, Pat and Polinaria would have 8 children. So, he was always looking for money to put food in his growing family's mouths. By now, Pat Garrett was mostly involved in horse racing. He was constantly buying and racing his horses. He still spent just way too much money, and he was always in debt to someone. Back over in Lincoln County, in 1896, the previously mentioned Albert Fountain, the newspaper man and defense attorney for the kid, well, he had gained enormous influence and wealth after serving in the territorial legislature. He then became a dogged investigator of cattle theft. He arrested over a dozen men and was about to have dozens more arrested when he and his 8-year-old son were assumed killed while traveling from Lincoln to Las Cruces. Their bodies were never found. Obviously, the killers needed to be hunted down, and this was a pretty heinous crime. So the governor of New Mexico hired the one man everyone knew could hunt down an outlaw, Pat Garrett. It was a tough manhunt, and before long, the Pinkertons got involved. Heck, even Apache scouts got involved. And the manhunt lasted a long time. Long enough for Pat Garrett to become elected Doña Ana County Sheriff. By this time, he was a deputy U.S. Marshal, and now yet again, a sheriff. The case is convoluted, and it involves some political actors in southern New Mexico, some actors with a lot of sway, political actors and cattle barons. The man in charge of this ring, not the Santa Fe ring, mind you, but the man was a corrupt Democrat named Albert Fall. He probably had Fountain murdered, since some of his men were going to be indicted by Fountain. One of the people also fighting against this newly formed corrupt circle was a woman named Susan Barber. This was not the first time she fought a corrupt local ring. She was the most successful female rancher in all of New Mexico, and her previous name had been Susan McSween. Years after her husband was killed, she would finally find the success that Alex had sought in Lincoln County. Another Lincoln County War participant, actually the big bad guy, Jimmy Dolan, he would die peacefully in 1898 after a successful and lucrative career in politics. Back to Pat Garrett. Eventually, in 1898, Garrett and his posse would get into a shootout with two of the fugitives, but Garrett would be forced to give up the fight and let the men escape. And these are the fugitives he was looking for in the murder of Albert Fountain and his son. Garrett also lost one of his deputies in that gunfight. By 1899, the two men, Lee and Gilliland, the two men who escaped, they would be on trial for the murder of Fountain. Another man had been on trial earlier, but his case was dropped. In the end, none of the accused killers would see any jail time. Not for killing the deputy, nor for allegedly killing Fountain and his son. And actually, the bodies of Fountain and his son still have not been found. In 1899, Garrett would chase down and kill a fugitive in New Mexico. This man's name was Norman Newman. He was wanted for murder. The chase would end in an all-out brawl that involved pistol whipping, a bulldog named Old Booze, and a lot of fisticuffs before Garrett shot Newman in the back twice as he tried to run away. The fight had happened at the Cox residence, where Cox's wife's brother was also staying. This man's name was Print Road, and Gardner believes this man would eventually kill Pat Garrett, or at least one of the main suspects. After the fight at the Cox Ranch, Garrett quit the Star, and he retired from being county sheriff, although he probably could have stayed in that position for life. He would soon get a presidential appointment, though, from Theodore Roosevelt, and that would be as collector of customs in El Paso, which could also have been a great thing. But Garrett managed to mess that up and was out of that job by 1906. Garrett then practiced law in Old Mexico, but only once, before finding himself in quite the trouble with money. He was writing all of his old friends and all the people he knew for money and loans. Gardner claims that by 1908, Garrett was bitter, angry, desperate, and depressed. And then things spiraled out of control in 1909, when he and his son got entangled in a lease dispute with some goat herders. And this lease dispute would result in him being shot on the side of the road while peeing near Las Cruces, New Mexico. He had been shot twice, once in the head and once in the stomach. A dim-witted man named Brazel would make a confession to the sheriff, but it would later be dismissed. To this day, his murder remains a mystery. As for the other men involved in this story, many of their lives are incredibly interesting. I'll start with the tale of Billy Wilson of the Wilson Gang. He would get smallpox in prison in Santa Fe, but he would survive that, and he would escape from the Santa Fe prison before heading to Arizona. Once in Arizona, he would meet up with Tom Pickett. And Tom Pickett was never charged with anything, so he was let go. In a neat connection to my other episodes, Tom Pickett at that time was working for the Hash Knife Gang. And I talked about them in my Pleasant Valley War episode. They were a major factor in that. Eventually, Wilson would move to Old Mexico before sneaking into Texas, and apparently once there he changed his name to Dr. David Anderson. And this was actually the name he was born with, so technically he just changed his name back. Then his story gets even more interesting. Billy Wilson, now David Anderson, he would, with the help of Pat Garrett, the man who arrested him, he would receive a presidential pardon from Grover Cleveland. He was working as a U.S. Customs inspector, kind of like Pat Garrett would, when the man randomly ran into him in Texas. Eventually, upon a second chance encounter, Garrett became convinced that Anderson was Billy Wilson. And once that realization struck, Garrett got the man a pardon, since it seemed Anderson had cleaned up so well in life. Although, after the pardon, Anderson and another man would get into an argument that got so heated they both pulled out their guns and they fired at each other. An innocent bystander was unfortunately the only person hit, and he was killed. The two men were arrested, but naturally they were released. Shortly after that, Wilson, a.k.a. Anderson, cornered a man he'd been playing cards with in 1901, and he beat up the man, and then he robbed him of $13. Those charges were also dismissed. Well, Billy Wilson, David Anderson, who had since gotten married and had 2 kids, his story is still not over, and you'll never guess what his next job was. Or maybe you will, because it's a very constant theme in the wild and woolly West. Yep, he became a sheriff in Terrell County, and it seems he was well liked by the people. Even though he was an outlaw, he'd been called in a New Mexican paper a howling, bloodthirsty rustler. He was a counterfeiter, maybe on accident, maybe on purpose. He was a thief, a murderer, and he was an ex-friend of Billy the Kid. Despite all that, he was now sheriff. The people called him Doc, because apparently he was good with horses. Much later in 1918, Doc Anderson was called to a saloon as sheriff, where a certain Mr. Ed Valentine was drunkenly shooting at passersby. Anderson, knowing the man, went to go talk some sense into him. But instead, the moment Anderson opened the saloon door, Valentine shot him in the chest. He either died instantly or an hour later. So thus marked the end of Billy Wilson of the Wilson Gang, who turned Billy the Kid bad. Well, helped him turn bad, I guess. That's not really that fair. That being said, Anderson and Wilson, they may have been 2 separate people the entire time. I have no idea. But I like to think he's the same guy. Pat Garrett certainly thought so. Billy Wilson was born in Ohio or Arkansas. He became a cattle rustler at a young age. Killed a man in Arkansas, maybe. Killed a friend on accident in Oklahoma as a buffalo hunter, probably. Ended up in Dodge City where he met Rudabog and a couple others. They nicknamed him Buffalo Billy, which I wish I had known earlier. They then moved to Las Vegas where they became citizen police for a time. And then at some point, Wilson moved and owned a bunch of horses in White Oaks, which he would sell. Now comes the counterfeit money part. He was apparently given fake bills for his stable. I did not know this when I did my earlier research. I thought he himself had made the counterfeit money. Well, he either knowingly or unknowingly spent that fake money, which got him chased by the feds, and by now we're caught up with Billy the Kid, whom he met in White Oaks. Well, this man, he would become sheriff, as many outlaws do, and he'd be shot and killed, as many outlaws and lawmen are. He had quite the incredible life. Ed Valentine, his murderer, was mobbed by the townsfolk and lynched. As for Tom Pickett, you guessed it, he also later became a sheriff deputy. After parting ways with the Hash Knife Gang, he became a bartender, a stagecoach driver. He got arrested in Texas for old cattle rustling charges, but he paid a fine and then returned to Arizona. And that's when he became a deputy in Holbrook around 1912. Later in 1923, he'd become deputy again in Winslow. Both these Route 66 towns were still rough and tumble at that time. He'd eventually have a leg sawed off on account of a gunshot wound he got as bartender decades before. But he'd keep wearing that badge. Pickett was probably in town when Everett Ruiz passed through in 1932. But eventually, he would pass away in 1934. Rudabog, possibly nicknamed Dirty Dave, he was sent from the Santa Fe jail to the Las Vegas jail. He was going to be hanged for the murder of the lawman there, which occurred when he was part of the Citizen Patrol. If you'll recall the whole scene on the train platform. Well, obviously, because jails were just suggestions in those days, he escaped in 1881. And now this is where it gets interesting, because this is a lot of speculation. But he eventually made it to Tombstone, Arizona, where he probably helped kill Morgan Earp and probably shot Virgil Earp. Now, if you'll recall, Rudabog had Wyatt Earp after him for years. Rudabog is the reason Wyatt Earp met up with Doc Holliday down in Texas in the first place. He may have even been, Rudabog, a part of the shootout at the OK Corral, but that can't be proven. After the action got too heavy in Arizona, Dirty Dave crossed the border and lived in Old Mexico. He'd work at a ranch, but he'd get fired for being a thief. He'd then move, allegedly, to Parral, Chihuahua, Mexico. And there, as the story goes, he would get into a shootout at a cantina. He'd kill 2 men at a table and wound another before the townsfolk pumped him full of lead. This was 1886. The townsfolk then supposedly hacked off his head with a machete and placed it on a stake in the town square for 3 weeks. Either that, or Rudabog died in a miners' riot in Colorado in 1898, or he died an old man in Oregon. Who knows? Nobody alive knows. Interesting man, though. As for the remaining regulators, Middleton disappears from the records after having a rough post-outlaw life in Kansas. Sam Corbett, regulator partisan, he had a successful life, although a sad one. He lost 2 wives and would eventually settle down in Texas after living in Old and New Mexico back and forth. He died in Texas in 1923. Fred Waite, who was a quarter Chickasaw from Oklahoma, he returned to Oklahoma after the war, the Lincoln County War, and he would eventually become head of the Chickasaw Tribal Police. 1 foot in the law, 1 foot out of it, these guys. But his life becomes incredibly intriguing as well. He would eventually own a cattle ranch, become a representative of the Chickasaw Nation, and then Attorney General and National Secretary of the Chickasaw Nation before finally being governor of the Chickasaw Nation, which is just incredible. But one day after his 42nd birthday, he would die from rheumatism in 1895. Doc Scurlock would become a farmer, doctor, and teacher in Texas before dying from a heart attack in 1929. Later in life, he would boast that after Billy the Kid's escape from Lincoln, he came and stayed with Doc a few days in Tascosa, Texas. Doc claimed Billy held his newborn, John Joshua Scurlock, during those few days of visit. After the war, Robert Weideman would travel to London to meet with Tunstall's father before he settled in New York State. He would die there in 1930 after being the director at the Haverstraw Light and Gas Company in Rockland County. In 1917, Susan Barber, who used to be Susan McSween, she sold her enormous ranch to Albert Fall, a man mentioned earlier. She then retired to the boom town of White Oaks. But by then, it was practically abandoned. She was one of the town's only residents. She died at 86 in 1931. She was one of the last surviving participants in the Lincoln County War, which had seen so many of her friends and her husband killed. And all of these stories of the participants later in life really makes me wonder what kind of man Billy the Kid would have grown up to have been. Who knows? Maybe he could have ended up as Billy Wilson or Doc Anderson's sheriff deputy with a wife and family of his own. I will let Maurice G. Fulton help me close out this series over Billy the Kid with a quote. Since the decimation and dispersal of the McSween Party in July 1878, when Billy's role had changed from one of partisan fighting man to that of a hunted outlaw, his name and fame had spread throughout the territory. To some, particularly to many of the native New Mexicans, he was a hero and the victim of circumstance. In the eyes of others, he was a bloodthirsty villain. He had become a legend in his own time, and now would pass into the permanent folklore of the frontier. As I mentioned when I opened the series, I did not know much about Billy the Kid or the Regulators or Pat Garrett or the Lincoln County War. I read to hell on a fast horse for fun, and I enjoyed it. But barely any of the book is even about Billy the Kid, so I picked up Maurice G. Fulton's History of the Lincoln County War. That was also good, but again, I needed more. It was then I discovered George R. Matthews' new book, and I instantly knew this was the story I needed. This was the story I longed for. Once I got about only 2 pages in, I realized, oh no, I was going to write a whole series over this. But I'm really glad I did. I come away from the war and the kid really sympathizing with him, the Regulators, McSween, and Tunstall. But I truly do sympathize with Billy, at least up until he joins Billy Wilson's crew. But despite what the detractors say, the man was not an insane murderer. Yes, he killed the bully Cahill in Arizona. He was party to the killing of Brady and Hindman, although no one alive can say if he pulled the trigger on any of them or not. Yes, he killed the drifter from Texas, Joe Grant, in self-defense. And of course, he probably shot twice at Carlisle as he escaped the ranch. That may have been the most unjustified murder of them all. There was simply no need for him to shoot at or hit the man escaping for his life. That's why I believe he shouldn't have hooked up with, however that happened, with Wilson and Rudabog. And yes, of course, he did without a doubt kill Deputies Bell and Olinger. In my opinion, they're in no way justified, but they were necessary in the kid's mind to escape. I think the murders and the thefts in the rough and tumble life were from growing up without parents in a time and place where being wild and dangerous kept you alive. What happened to he and his friends in Lincoln is an absolute horrific story of corruption and overwhelming odds. Tunstall, McSween, the Regulators, the kid, they never stood a chance against the house or the ring or the onslaught of modernity. Nobody survives being the target of people that powerful. But like the many stories and novels and tales, the Billy the Kid Museum in Fort Sumner, the town, is full of inaccuracies. His life has become more legend than fact. The books I read, except for Matthew's book, are also littered with inaccuracies or scenes and lines that have been pinned to the kid or were invented by later authors and given to the kid. It's good to get a fresh and real and authentic take on Billy, and I hope I gave that to you. My best friend here in New Mexico and fellow Regulator, he grew up in the state, and he told me while we were fishing on the Pecos recently that even though they cram the story of Billy the Kid and the Lincoln County War into your brain from a very young age here, he has thoroughly enjoyed my retelling of the tale. He said he's learned a lot that he never knew, and that I have corrected the record on many things he thought were true. But that wasn't me. That was George R. Matthews. And I will soon be releasing our interview. It was a lot of fun. I don't want to glorify outlaws, but there's something in Billy the Kid's life and legend that put me firmly behind him. I hope that his story and the story of the war can influence young men to become regulators themselves, striking blows in defense of justice. Thank y'all for listening, and I'll see you again soon in the American Southwest.
Came down from Alamosa, across the Rio Grande, the track a killer lion, lost his fear of man. First seen around El Rito, he laid a rancher down, killed the rancher's daughter, was gone out of sound. And the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Not much trace of man out here, the painted canyon walls, the ancient pagan hunters showed the chase and fall. Now the lever action rifle and horses changed the game, but their ghosts still hunt beside me, the chase still feels the same. And the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the hounds my father left me are ranging out of sight. I stand up in my saddle in the early morning light. I can see the good gyp circle, and I know it won't be long till the canyon rings are striking cry, the lion will be found. Purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Finds a lonely juniper to make his final stand. 3 faithful hounds lie dying, blood shining on the sand. And the good gyp leaps up in the air, as low as murder charge. My rifle cracks, a whisper late, I can feel his iron jaw. The purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the eagle sees us falling, the hunter and the prey. His shadow crosses lifeless bodies, where side by side we lay. And the good gyp sits upon the rim, and all alone she cries a death song for her master, killed the mighty lion. Purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Yeah, the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds.